Fantastic. Thank you, John.
With any luck, we'll be good.
John Sellens.
So there's a USB key coming around. Most people have seen that. And if you go to my website, the slides are there. I put them there with a fabulous rsync command. And there's no PowerPoint involved in any of this stuff, so we should be good. Now, I've been talking about Nagios and monitoring for a bunch of years now, and this is I normally give this as a 3-hour class. Today it's 1 hour and 45. So on the weekend, I was frantically typing in magic LaTeX commands to comment out this bit and comment out that bit. I'm guessing we're maybe in the 1 hour 45 range. We'll see how it goes. If I look at my watch and towards the end and I say, holy crap, just, cut me a little slack is all I'm saying. So what I'm going to try and do today is introduce you, I hope, to some of the non-obvious bits in Nagios, what I think of the non-obvious bits. I'm assuming that probably most of the people here have some familiarity with Nagios. I'm going to try not to hit the low-level stuff. If there's Nagios developers in this room, feel free to tell me where I'm wrong. I'm hoping there won't be too many of those, but we'll see how it goes. I always start out with a religion slide. And I notice that here, other people have been talking, and people say, you want to check a remote machine? Well, you use NRPE or things like that. And I say, so my religion is several-fold. But monitoring, I always talk about exceptions, trending, history. History is when you're collecting data for billing or law enforcement. We're not talking about that. Trending is when you make pretty pictures. I tend to believe having pretty pictures of graphs over time is best done by tools outside of Nagios. Many people disagree with that point of view. But I'm an old school Unix guy. One tool does one job well. And I think for my way of looking at the world, sometimes doing graphing outside in something like Cacti or Munin or MRTG or any number of other things is a good way to go. Some people say, but you're collecting the same data twice? And I say, yes, but I'm collecting it in little short 400-byte UDP packets over my gigabit network. The extra network overhead is irrelevant in many cases. That's my claim anyway. SNMP is your friend. So wherever possible, I think if you want to get information off a remote machine, use SNMP to get that information. I try and avoid doing check by SSH or NRPE, but on the other hand, I'll mention something else later that completely contradicts what I just said there. My argument for using SNMP is you probably have some switches or some routers or some firewalls or some appliances of one kind or another in your network that you want to talk to. You probably have to do SNMP to them anyway. So therefore, you have SNMP running over your network. You're using SNMP plugins. Why not use it as widely as possible for consistency across all your devices, whether it's a server or a network device? Not everyone agrees with me. We can discuss it at the reception tonight. And this is a plug for my talk tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and I hope everybody's there on time, myself included. I believe you can solve any problem in computer science with another layer of indirection. And I mentioned that a few times here today, and there'll be more tomorrow, with any luck. I was thinking that my phone just went off, and it was a Twitter. It wasn't an alert. I thought we should have a contest during these 3 days of who gets the most alerts from their Nagios servers. And if you get the most pages over this 3-day period, then you win, I don't know, our sympathy or something like that. So the important thing here that I wanted to point out, down at the bottom, Nagios Core, it's just an engine. It schedules stuff and it runs commands. It's not any smarter than that. It schedules stuff in nicely, and it does some interesting things, and you can sometimes do, well, if I ran this and this happened, then do this other thing as well. But really, Nagios Core is just a thing that runs commands and perhaps reacts based on what that command told it back. And the other element here, discrete components, and I've got a picture that I stole from Ethan on the next page or so to reinforce that idea. When I first started looking at NetSaint many years ago, I was actually in a hotel room before, and I was talking about SNMP or monitoring the next day with a whole bunch of tools that are now dead and gone. And I said, well, let me try installing this NetSaint thing and see what it's like. And it installed so nicely and cleanly, and everything worked. But one of the things I noticed was that Nagios Core and the Nagios plugins were separate packages. And I thought, well, that's just crazy. That's just nutty. And not only were they separate packages, but they're separate maintainers. You know, there's the Nagios Core team and the Nagios plugins team. And I thought, this is insane. And I was wrong. It's actually part of the brilliance that is Nagios. I can say brilliance here, right? Because this is, you know, everybody likes Nagios here, right? So it's all brilliant. So the important things here are that really Nagios has the core components, and they've got well-defined interfaces between them, and that is a huge win. And hopefully I can demonstrate some of that today and tomorrow as well. Well over 1 million installations. You know, Ethan was at Ohio Linux 2 years ago, and he talked about Nagios. He said, there's over 1 million known Nagios 3 instances. And I thought, how does he know that? You know, when you go to the Nagios homepage on your monitoring system and it pops up information like about the conference or there's an update available, that's how he knows that. Because when it starts up, it goes to one of his servers and says, hello, I'm here, and what have you got for me? So used widely, we know that. So here's the picture I stole. And I forget the conference, but in the notes it says exactly what conference, so I'm giving credit where credit is due. And the reason I like this picture is that it shows the different parts of it. So here's like core Nagios, there's the web server and the CGIs, external applications, that's anything else you might want to tie into Nagios. Check commands, those are the plugins, the things you're actually interested in monitoring over here, and the 2 people over there standing by just in case anything ever goes wrong. And you know, there's config data there and state data, external command files. So it shows all the different parts, and it reinforces the idea that there are interfaces between all those components. And it doesn't show it here, but those are all well-defined interfaces. So for example, the external command file where it's a pipe in the file system, and you can shove commands in there to do things like, schedule downtime or acknowledge a problem or things like that. And you can also do that to, can you do everything in the files now? Well, there's a couple ways to do some things, but basically there's an interface where you can throw commands at Nagios. And there is a web page that says, here are all the 140 some odd commands you can stuff in the external command pipe and exactly what they do. And the interface between a plugin and the Nagios core, it's well defined. You know, you get some stuff on the command line, you get some environment variables, you run something, and you return a 0, 1, 2, 3 as the exit status, and some text. So it's very well defined, but very simple interfaces between all the parts. And that's part of the brilliance. Back in the old days, everybody built everything from source. You know, you'd get it off the net, you know, get it from comp sources, Unix on the Usenet thing. You've heard of Usenet, right? Yeah, okay, good. You're all making that up because I'm far older than most of you guys. And so everybody would compile everything from source. Nowadays, mostly you just type, you know, yum install Nagios or apt-get install Nagios, or I'm a FreeBSD guy, so I go to the ports tree and install it there. So most times we just accept the defaults. But I wanted to mention in particular 2 things. So there's an embedded Perl interpreter that you can have inside the Nagios core. And in the olden days when machines were slow and there wasn't much memory and it would take Perl a long time to start up, maybe that was a good idea. But now we have much faster CPUs, much more memory. Perl still takes a long time to start up, but I think it's, you know, something that we can deal with. So my religion says don't embed Perl in Nagios. It just makes things behave weirdly. If you look in the documentation, it mentions there are certain things you can do in a Perl script that work in the embedded, that work normally but will not work with the embedded Perl. So my religion is just avoid the embedded Perl. And the other thing you want to do is enable Event Broker. That enables the Event Broker interface, of course, so you can do things like NDO utils and, oh, what's the other thing I'm thinking of that's really cool? There's an overview interface called Thruk. So there's Nagios Fusion, which gives you an interface looking at multiple different Nagios instances. Thruk is another tool along those same lines, and it uses, I forget what it is, I think it's in the notes later on. But basically there's an Event Broker interface, a plugin that gets run on your Nagios servers on the remote side, and Thruk gets that information out of those remote Nagios servers very quickly and effectively. So enable the event broker, turn off the embedded Perl, and follow the instructions. One of the things that's potentially a problem that you should watch out for, and I mention this here because it's sort of a config thing, sort of a build thing, and well, the slide's always been here. So one of the things about a monitoring system is when your monitoring system is working, it's watching everything else, but you got to make sure that your monitoring system keeps working. In the old days, you used to be able to specify in the web interface a command to run to check to see if Nagios was still running, and that was the Nagios check command. So you could set that in the CGIs, and it would be run every once in a while, and it would tell you if Nagios was dead. So it would actually show up in the web interface. And I actually tested this on the weekend just to make sure I'm not blowing smoke here. But most times, if Nagios is shut down, most times it will remove its status.dat file. That's the file in the file system where all the information is kept about what's up and what's down and what's running and what's not running. And the CGIs typically will read that status.dat file. However, if Nagios dies a horrible death, so for example, if the machine it's on runs out of memory and it just happens to get killed, it's possible for the status.dat file to be left around. If it's left around, nothing notices that Nagios isn't running. So the web interface still says, oh yeah, I just updated myself within the last 90 seconds and everything's just fine. So you got to be careful just to make sure that Nagios hasn't died. And you can either have two Nagios boxes watching each other, or you can set up a cron job or something that will make sure the status.dat file is not too old, that the processes are still there, and send you email or something like that. So just something to watch out for is my suggestion anyway. So configuration basics, and you probably know most of these things. I'm going to cover a few things that I think are worth reinforcing. So in Nagios configuration, you have to have one file. You have to have a file nagios.config. It doesn't actually have to be called that, but if you call it something else, you're just being obtuse. And the nagios.config file, of course, sets all the options for how Nagios itself runs, how often it does certain things, certain command parameters and things like that. And it also tells Nagios where to find other files that it needs. And it points to the resource.config file, and it points to the object definition files. So resource.config, that just sets global variables. That's the user1, user2 macros. And by convention, user1 is the name of the directory where all the plugins are stored, and user2 is where the exception handlers are stored. You can do something different if you want, but again, go with convention and stick along that way. Now, resource config is actually optional, but it's handy to have. Another use for the resource config is to, if you want to put passwords or things like that, so if you need to access your database or SSH off somewhere else, you can put those keys in the resource config file, and in theory, those entries are not visible to the web interface. So that if somebody's come in, you can put secrets in that file and the secrets will be safe, more or less. So most times you'll need to have a resource config file. Technically it's optional, but there you go. The other of the three main files is the CGI config file, and it controls the web interface behavior, who can access what, and things like that. And one of the things that the Nagios documentation says is, and it's said this for years, says the optional web interface. And if you think about it, it's true. It is optional. You don't have to run the web interface to have Nagios running. It's handy to have around, but it's optional. But again, I think part of the value of that wording where it says optional web interface is to reinforce the idea that they're all discrete components. You can choose what you want, and you can tie them together however you need to do it to make it work in your environment. One of the things that people have complained about forever is people look at the web interface and say, oh, it's so ugly. It is so terrible. Where's the AJAX? Where's the PHP? Why isn't it database backed? And I always think there's a certain amount of hooey in those kind of observations. Again, it's my religion. You can't fault me for my religion. It's against, good moral principles or something like that. But anyway, so you can replace the web interface if you really wanted. But again, it reinforces the idea that they're two discrete components, the web interface and the Nagios core. The other important thing I want to mention here is that over the years, I've used a lot of open source software, freely available software, and some of it is fabulous and some of it is, not quite so fabulous. But one of the things that I've always had trouble with is the documentation for many projects out there is maybe not as nice as you'd like it to be. And the thing that's always impressed me to a huge extent about the Nagios documentation is that it's documented, everything is documented, that it's actually written in a comprehensible fashion, and it's cross-referenced, and it solves so many problems. So for example, if you need to know what macros are available, what variables you can substitute into command lines or things like that, it is exhaustively documented in the guide. It says, here are the macros, here's what they mean, here's the exact times when they're available. I was going to say, wait, are there one or two things that it's maybe not as clear on as it could be? Quite possibly. But the documentation is a huge win. So if you want to figure out why something behaves in a certain way or anything like that, it's almost always in the documentation, which is a good thing. The other thing about the configuration basics, I mentioned that you need to have object definition files, and I'll talk about those in subsequent slides. But basically, Nagios configuration, you need to have one file. You probably want to have two more files, and then you probably want to have at least one file that defines all your objects. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'm an old school Unix guy, text files. I don't do XI. I don't do Nagios QL. In a previous job, I used to use the nagmin interface, which is a webmin plugin for managing old style Nagios config files, and I hated it, but that's just what we had to do there. So I'm assuming, I think what happens with, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nagios XI uses the Nagios QL interface for setting up the configurations. That's stored in a database, and when you generate the config, it's extracted from the database, stuffed into files, and then the Nagios core reads those files and starts up. So if I'm talking about config files and you prefer the web interface for managing them, just imagine that you're clicking things while I'm typing things into VI. Okay, we know that everything that Nagios actually does is done by an external command of one form or another, notifications and plugins and things like that. And as I said earlier, you've probably all disabled the embedded Perl interpreter, so I don't have to say anything. Well, really, they're partly running in the Nagios core. And over the past few years, I've really noticed that three, four, that kind of range, the plugin development team has put in a lot of effort to make things as consistent as possible. And there's modules, like there's a Perl module, there's shell stuff, and I think there's a C library, if I recall, for doing plugins to provide even more consistency to the standard plugin syntax. There's a bunch of standard arguments like -H is the host you're going to check and things like that. So that's all good thing. And I'm going to say this over and over, and I'll mention this again tomorrow and several times. Writing a plugin is easy. The hard part about a plugin is figuring out how to get the information that you want. But once you have a way to collect that information, putting a plugin around it, that's trivial. A plugin is just a shell script that runs a command, looks at the exit status, and it spits out a message, and then exits 0, 1, 2, 3 for OK, warning, critical, or unknown. So if you have a question you're trying to solve with your Nagios server, and you don't see an obvious way to do it with the existing stuff, of course you go to Google or Nagios Exchange right away. But don't be afraid to write your own plugins, because it's really not that hard. One thing I want to mention, different plugins have critical and warning levels. So if you're checking disk space, it may say how much space I have left or a percentage, how many gigabytes. If you're doing a network latency check with check ping, you say, I want to make sure that the round trip time is less than this number of milliseconds and I lose no more than this percentage of packets. So the critical and warning levels on a plugin are typically the things you pass to a -C or a -W option. They're all over the map, but they make sense for that particular plugin. Too far. Probably no one we care about is running Nagios version 2 anymore, because 3's been out for a bunch of years now. In the olden days, you could have one line of plugin output, and it was limited in the total number of characters. And the total number of characters had to do with the length that you could write atomically into the pipe in Linux, something like that. So now we can pretty much spit out as long a message as you want, and you can do multi-lines. If you do send multi-line output, at least in the standard web interface, you only see the single line of output on the web interface, but I don't do multi-line myself, but I think if you click on the service message or the service details, it'll show you the full output of the plugin there. Exit codes that we mentioned. And as I mentioned earlier, Nagios doesn't look at the message at all. It doesn't care what language it's in or even if it makes any sense. It just looks at the exit status returned from the command when it ran. And performance data, I better get this right. It's an OR bar. So when your plugin spits out a bunch of information, so it says, okay, the web server is good, I got the page I expected, it can put an OR bar in the message, and then following that, it can put name equals value for performance data, and that's what people use to generate graphs and things like that. There's various setup options in Nagios to get that performance data and either run a command on it or stuff it into a file for something else to look at later. I don't use the performance data much, and as I said earlier, that's because I do my graphing elsewhere. Over the years, I have a bunch of performance data files going back far too long, and I keep saying, yeah, I'm going to try out those graphing things one of these days, and one of these days hasn't quite come yet. There's a thing called plugin extra options, and I think you have to enable it when you build the plugins. But basically, it allows you, if it's a plugin you're talking to, and it uses the standard option parsing stuff in the Nagios plugins package, you can give it an option -- extra ops equals section file, and it will go look that up in a file, and it will use those options as options just as if they were on the command line, more or less. And the config files are in the standard Windows INI file format where you've got section in square brackets and then key equals value of various things. And it searches for those files somewhere. Oh yeah, and when you build the Nagios plugins, you say enable extra ops on the configure command. And I looked at this and I said, why? Why would I want it? I just didn't get it. And 2 years ago at Ohio Linux, and Ethan and Mary were kind enough to sit in the back of the class that I was teaching about Nagios and not laugh too hard. And afterwards, Ethan said, it's so you can put passwords in that file and they don't show up in the output of PS from your Linux command line. So put secrets in that file, and then it doesn't show up for other people to snoop around your machine. Otherwise, you can just put all the stuff on the command line, or there's multiple ways to solve that problem. I said I liked another level of indirection. So if a plugin mostly does what you want, but not exactly what you want, write a wrapper around it to twist its output to your needs, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow if you're awake at 9 o'clock, and if you choose to come and see me tomorrow morning. One of the things to worry about as machines scale up. Now, I have to admit, I'm not a large-scale guy. There's all sorts of funny rejoinders to that. But in terms of Nagios, a number of hosts and services and things like that, I don't deal with real huge environments, and I haven't yet. So I haven't hit some of the performance limits that some of you are probably facing. But I just wanted to point out that if you write a sloppy plugin that doesn't worry about what it's doing, then as you start running that plugin 10,000 times every 5 minutes, you might notice that you need to buy a bigger, faster machine. So just keep that in mind. If you're doing something, I mean, if your environment is relatively contained these days, I mean, who cares how fast things are or not? So. I'll mention here about two styles of plugins, and I think of them as local checks or remote checks. A local plugin is something like check disk, which runs the df command, interprets the output of the df command, and gives you that information back. It's looking at something on the local machine and telling you something about it. Remote checks are things like connect to that web server over there, get this page, and do a regular expression check against that. So you're checking something over there. And yeah, and to invoke those remote checks, well, there's the plugin itself. Sometimes you'll run it on your local machine, and it will go over there, and it will check something over there, the plugin itself. So check SNMP, for example, you can use the check SNMP plugin to ask about, say, an interface status on that device over there. Is that switch port up or down? And you can do that with an SNMP query. So that's like a remote check. There are tools that you can wrap around local checks or any other check that allow you to sit here and cause that check to run over there. So that's things like a check by SSH or a check NRPE that are basically ways to get over there, cause a command to run, and get the information back. But, yeah, so the point I was trying to make is that there are plugins that act locally on this machine, plugins that act remotely. And again, talking about religion, I keep coming back to that. I like to do SNMP wherever I can. So if I need to run a local plugin, something like check disk to check disk space, I'll put that in my netsnmp snmpd.conf file on the remote machine, and I'll do an SNMP query to cause the SNMP daemon to run that command for me and send the information back. And my argument again is that, you know, the fewer protocols you have running over your network, that's probably a good thing. And SNMP, you know, seems to work well. But the other two ways of doing it typically are check by SSH or use NRPE to do things over there. I'm going to stop here. I think I mentioned it later. Oh, do I? I don't know. So there's passive and active checks. So an active check is where the Nagios server says, oh, it's time to do this check. It runs some command, checks, is the web server still up? Is the disk too full? Is the CPU busy? And takes that information back. There are passive checks as well, where something else runs a check of some kind and passes that information back to the Nagios server and says, by the way, I checked, the web server is up, everything's fine. So active versus passive checks. My religion tends to be, and again, this can sometimes be a scalability issue. I like active checks. I like having this thing automatically going out and doing things, checking things at the right time from this location. As you scale up, there's a school of thought saying if you can avoid having the Nagios server running all these commands, then life can be better. You don't need your server to be as big, and the other things can pass information in. I sometimes buy that argument. Sometimes I buy it less. With things like DNX and Mod Gearman, which I know nothing about, by the way, you can distribute some of that load across multiple machines that act like essentially one central Nagios server. So I prefer active checks rather than passive checks, but again, that's a religion kind of deal. So remember, I said there were 3 core files plus the object definitions. When Nagios starts up, it digests all those files, makes sure they're all consistent, and then starts running. And so there is, in the init scripts, you can say service Nagios restart or reload. There are some bits of software out there that will actually keep on running, reload the configuration, and just carry right on. I believe what Nagios does is if you say reload, maybe does a sanity check on the files, and then stops itself and restarts itself. So it's not really reloading, it's restarting, but do it in a nice, quick, tidy way. When I first looked at Nagios, this was back in the olden days, and you install the sample configuration files, and there was like 20 different sample configuration files. And I thought, holy crap, there's too much stuff here. But as I looked at it, I said, oh, wait, but the syntax for all these files is consistent, and all these things kind of make sense and is documented, and they're just split up into separate files just for comprehensibility. These days, when you install Nagios, you typically get like 3 different object configuration files, which is maybe less daunting when you first look at it. Some people in this computing world of ours, there's different ways to approach configuration. Some people like having a GUI interface where you're kind of guided through. Some people like going from text files and from basic things. I fall into the latter camp. If you're just looking at the text files and the number of things you can put in these files, it can sometimes be a little daunting. But with the documentation and all the examples that are there, I'll claim it's not as bad as it might look at first glance. And as I said, they're all perfectly documented. Okay, so these three files, Nagios config, resource config, CGI config, they're all just name equals value files. They've got hash sign comments, either in the first column or anywhere, I think anywhere on the line, but maybe just keep the comments right in the first column. And the important one thing here, the variables in those files, they're case sensitive. So just keep that in mind. All the example, pretty much, I think everything is entirely lowercase, but they are case sensitive, so just keep that in mind. When I type things into my iPhone, it likes to capitalize the first letter, and sometimes I just want to slap it. So just keep that in mind. Oh, one of the things to be aware of, the location of the CGI config file, that's actually compiled into the CGIs. So the CGIs are C programs. In them, they have where to look for the CGI config files. You can't just move it around arbitrarily unless you're going to recompile. Oh, and the other thing I should mention, CGI config refers back to Nagios config so that the CGIs can get some information out of the Nagios config file. So there's pointers in two directions there. There's another one I really should mention here, and I just forgot it. I was looking at it this morning. I like to point out check result reaper frequency. So in Unix, when you run a command, it forks off a process, and eventually something has to wait for that process and get the result code from it. Nagios, by default, does that every 10 seconds, I think. So check result reaper frequency is 10 seconds, which means that when it forks off a plugin, 10 seconds later it'll come back and say, have any of my plugins finished? Do you have any results for me? And it'll gather it all up at that point. And my argument is that if you set check result reaper frequency lower, like down to 1 second, it will not harm anything and it'll make things run just a little quicker. And if you're on a Linux box, it will lower the reported load average on that box. Because I believe that Linux reports a program that is waiting to be reaped. So a child that is finished, just waiting for its parent to get the result code from it, I think that reports as one more load average increment, which to my mind is insane, but there you go. The other one I wanted to mention was there's an equivalent variable, which I forget, but it's documented in the file. These days, as of version 3, plugins can put their results in a directory, the check results directory, and then Nagios comes along every once in a while and reads the results out of those files. And that's how we got the multi-line plugin output and things like that. There's a configuration variable that says how often to look in that directory. I think it defaults to 10 seconds. If you're starting to scale things up and doing lots of things, you might want to make that number a little bit smaller. And I haven't looked at the code. I don't know if it's entirely true. I suspect probably what it does is it's got an event loop and says, has this, I'm doing things, oh, I got nothing to do now. Is it time for me to check that directory? So if you lower that number, I don't think it will harm anything. I think it'll just give you a little bit faster performance in some cases. Object configuration files, that's where you define things, everything like a host or a service or a command or a contact group or an escalation. Those are all objects. And they all have the same syntax consistency. You've probably noticed that. You may not have noticed that it really is consistent across all the different items. I'll point out a few different object things that are pretty consistent across everything. That makes no sense. Nagios config tells Nagios where to look for those object definition files. My suggestion is set config_dir in your Nagios config file to point to where you're going to put your object definitions and leave it alone. Some people believe that you should list every file in the Nagios config with config_file. That just means that every time you make a change or add a new config file, you have to go and change your Nagios config file. Don't do that. Use config_dir. And it does recursion too, so you can have a tree full of files. You can organize them however you want. Nagios will look through them and do the right thing. I can't remember if I mentioned this later on. An important thing to think about the configuration files There's no ordering there, so they're not read in, they might be read in alphabetical order, I don't think they are. But the order in which you put things in those files, the location within the files, it's all irrelevant. And if somebody's smarter than I and knows that I'm wrong there, please correct me, but I don't think that's the case. I believe what Nagios does is it reads everything in those files, sucks all that information up into data structures, and then looks to make sure all the data is consistent. So you can put things in those files in any order. You can spread them out among as many files as you want, or just one file, whatever works best for you. The ordering doesn't matter. When you define an object, it's always define, the type of the object, and then the different things you could set are directive and value. And I noticed that in the documentation, sometimes it says, instead of directive, it says variable, but I like directive because it makes more sense to me. So it's always directive value. In almost every case, the last value of the directive you see in a definition is the one that is used. So for example, if you're defining a host and you say host address is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then later on you say host address is 5, 6, 7, 8, it's the second one that is used, and the first one is silently ignored. In most cases, there's a couple of directives where you can have multiple instances of that directive in a definition, and all of them are observed. And I think I mentioned later on which it is. But in the general case, it's the last one that's used. And that also applies if you think about template inheritance, where you say use a template in your definitions, and you've got a standard definition for a host, and you're defining a particular host, and you say, well, use the standard definition for hosts that are in Chicago, and inherit all those things, and then you're adding these things on, they replace what came before. One of the things that always confused me is, back in the old days, I used to do some C programming, and in the C language, you can say number include file name. And the same way in a shell script, you can say dot to source a file of shell commands, and each one is done in turn. And I thought, oh, the use directive, where you inherit from a template, I could do that multiple times. I could say, well, use this template, and then use this template. I expected it to act the same way. It doesn't. So what Nagios does is it takes the final use directive that it sees in the definition of an object, and that's what it uses. And in Nagios 3, as we know, we can have multiple template inheritance, which I'll mention shortly. And an interesting thing, and I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, normally when we define a template, so for example, we're defining a template for the standard attributes for a web host that's in the data center in Chicago. And we define who should be notified or what the network parents of it are, or things like that in the standard template. And normally what we'll do is we'll say register 0, which means this is not an actual object. I'm only going to use this as a template. You can also, and then later on you'll say use Chicago web host and include that in the definition of an actual host. You can use a registered object as a template as well. So for example, you could define web host A with all these things. And then when you're defining web host B, you could just say use web host A and replace the name and replace the address. So you're using an object definition of an actual object as a template. I think that's probably a bad thing to do. So if you find yourself wanting to use an object that is not a template, not register 0, just step away from the keyboard and back off. I think it's a bad name. But I just discovered that you could actually do that, which makes sense, but was kind of surprising one way or another. One of the things that's worth mentioning here, I think, in an object definition, you say use template name. It doesn't matter where in the object definition that appears. It can be the last item in the object definition stanza, and it will still be evaluated first, and then everything else will follow on. And I think that's related to the way that I believe Nagios works, that it sucks up all its data, sets various variables based on the host definitions, and then evaluates them in the appropriate order. And it used to be you could only use one template, but now, of course, you can have a comma-separated list of templates, which gives you a little more flexibility. So you can say use Chicago, comma, web host, comma, Windows, comma, not my problem, all those things, and it'll do the right thing. And every time I talk about Nagios, I say, oh, the template inheritance, it's some sort of a mathematical graph. And I took graph theory in third year university, and I forgot everything about it. And every time I say, I have to figure out what kind of graph it is, and I looked it up this weekend. It is a directed acyclic graph. So if you need to figure out if your Nagios template inheritance is okay, just put it into a graph analysis program and figure out if you've got a directed acyclic graph, and you can tell if it's good or bad. I'm kind of kidding about that. I stole this picture. All my pictures are stolen from somewhere. This is intended to show you just how the template inheritance works. You can follow through at home when you're trying to go to sleep tonight and not quite getting it. Basically, the dotted line that goes up, that's decreasing priority. So, for example, I've defined a host called devweb1, and in it I said use 148. And the things defined in the template numbered 1 are the highest priority, and 8 is the lowest priority. So basically, it's when you say use, the first thing you encounter, it essentially evaluates the last thing first, and then keeps replacing anything defined there as you get closer and closer to the word use. So you just have to know. On the other hand, think about arranging your templates in a way that the ordering doesn't matter, and then you'll save yourself some trouble. The other interesting thing about directives and values, you can append to a value by saying directive plus value, and you can reset it to empty, so directive null. That's especially handy for host groups, I will claim. So you can define a template that says Linux boxes, and then you define a particular host, and you say, this has all the standard host groups, plus it's also a web server, or plus it's also Bob's problem, or things like that. Yes? Go right ahead.
I know I've used that for contact groups, actually. It's kind of useful to be like, page everyone in this contact group and somebody else. Does it also have subtraction?
As far as I know, there is no subtraction. The notes I have, so that there's the additive inheritance, which I think is that directive plus value. I think that's what it's officially called. There's no subtractive. So if you need to take something out, I think what you've got to do is reset it to null and then add things on again. I can understand why it's built like that. But every once in a while, it would be nice to say not this. I think in hosts, where you're defining a host group, if you enable regular expression matching in Nagios config, you can give it a regular expression for all the hosts that are going to be members of this host group. So you can say anything that starts in web star, then any host that matches that regular expression web star will be included in this host group. And I think in host group definitions, you can say exclamation mark to be not. So you can say web star not web Toronto 1 or things like that. But I think that's the only case where subtraction is available, if I understand it. And he's nodding and he's nodding. So, well, we're the smartest guys in the room. So there's no exclude in this additive inheritance thing here. Custom directives. And I was mentioning this to this gentleman here in the elevator on the way down, because he said, I use Nagios XI, and I'm just kind of getting into it. I've only been using it for a couple of years or however long. And so he figures there's more things to learn. And I said, well, I've been talking about Nagios for more than a few years, and I just twigged onto how cool custom variables are. Just like last year, I thought, what an idiot. Custom directives, so you can make up any particular any variable name you want that'll go along with that thing you're defining. And most commonly, you'll see them in a host or a service definition, I believe. Yes, that's right there. You can use it in host, service, or contact definitions. I don't think you can use custom object variables anywhere else. I could be wrong, but they may not make sense anywhere else. But where I thought it was really cool, so I think the canonical example is an SNMP community string. SNMP community string is essentially the password for your SNMP query. And typically across your network, you'll have the same SNMP community string for all sorts of different devices. But maybe there's one device that you don't control and you have to override that. If you put in your lowest level template, your generic host template, if you define a custom object variable of SNMP community, as to be public or company name dot secret or something like that. Then when you get to a particular host that has a different community string, you can redefine that custom object variable to be what you need for that particular host. And then later on, when you do your command, in your command definition where you substitute in macros, remember you might say check HTTP-H $hostname and $arg1. You can substitute in the custom variables there as well. So on the check SNMP command where it says -C community string, you substitute in _SNMP community, and you get the one that applies to that particular host. Now the problem that I finally twigged to that made me say, custom variables, that's what I need, was doing load average checks. So we have a whole bunch of Linux machines, and we do have a load average check. So we have a check load and the warning level of a load average of 3 and a critical level of 5 and things like that. There are some machines we have with many CPUs that are always busy, and so it's okay for the load average to be high. And I could have written a separate command or a separate check and applied it just to those hosts, but I thought, custom object variables. So in our base generic host template, I define a variable called, I thought I had an example of it. I define _load_warn to be 3 as the default, and _load_crit to be 5 as the default. And then in my command definition for checking load average, I substitute those in. But on the big machines where the load average is always going to be high, I just replace those definitions with bigger numbers, and I get the proper behavior, and my configuration files are simpler and easier to deal with. And so that I figured out that was a big win. Sorry. And the important thing here is, so custom directives, they're case insensitive. Remember in the configuration files, everything's case sensitive, but custom variables, if you define it in a host definition to be all uppercase or all lowercase, it turns out the same. When you actually use them, they're all uppercase. So if you're doing a substitution on a command line or using an environment variable, the names of those things is all going to be uppercase. So just keep that in mind as you're doing it. And when you define a variable like _SNMP _community, it will be available as a macro of _host SNMP _community, or an environment variable with Nagios _ prepended there. All to avoid name clashes. There's another cool thing, implied inheritance, and this is new in 3, as we all have. It used to be that you had to define a contact group on every service check. Implied inheritance lets you say, the contact group for this host is Unix admins or Windows admins or printer guys or something. And on the service checks, if you don't define a separate contact, it just says, oh, must be the same contacts as the host. And that's a big deal because it just means you have to define who owns this particular host in only one place and not multiple places. And it makes it easier to adjust things if you need be, but the implied inheritance is pretty cool. And it applies in all those places there. Just about that time. Let me just run through this, then we'll take about a 5-minute break, stretch our legs, and then we'll carry on from there. I think there's 18 different object types. They're all there. You can read about them in the documentation tonight in front of the TV. I said earlier you should have a configure full of stuff. And, order is unimportant. Time period is like the lowest level building block. Time period doesn't depend on anything else. That's why I mentioned it here first. The important thing I want to say here is that object types have a type _name directive. So if you're defining a host, you have host _name. If you're defining an escalation, you have escalation _name. Sorry, for service escalation _name is the name of it. The alias is just a human readable phrase that shows up in the web interface. Nagios doesn't do anything with that. Time periods are really cool in 3 because you can exclude stuff. So you can set up weekdays except all the national holidays. The interesting thing here about the non-weekday definitions, they're called exceptions, even if you're also including them in a definition. So I found that phrasing confusing, but just keep that in mind. I'll just mention command definitions here because it shows macro substitution. We've probably already seen it with the dollar thing dollar. And I think if you have a dollar sign on there and it's not a macro that's being substituted, I think some confusion happens. So just don't put extraneous stuff on there that's not already expected to be defined. And my little example of using it in a service definition, you have the exclamation mark separating out the arguments. One of the questions about command line stuff and argument substitution is, for example, if you're doing an HTTP check, you're going and getting a web page, you're doing a regular expression match against the content of the web page. Sometimes regular expressions have lots of funny characters in them, like slashes and semicolons and asterisks, question marks, which are also important characters to the shell, so they need to be quoted. The question is, where do you do the quoting? When you say, set up your command definition, see right there I've got -p arg1. Do you put quotes around there and then just put the regular string in the service definition of what you're looking for? Or do you not put quotes there and then quote things in the service definition that are going to need quoting? I'm not sure what the best answer there is. My inclination is to do not put quotes in the command definition, quote things in the service definition when you need that. Because otherwise, if you put single quotes in your command definition, sooner or later you're going to want a regular expression that includes a single quote. And then how do you express that at all? So just keep that in mind. And you'll note port 70. If you got to check your Gopher server is still working, it's port 70. Okay, let's take about 5 minutes, stretch your legs, get a drink of water. I don't know if there's snacks out. There's probably no snacks because we had a nice big lunch. And see you back here shortly and we'll carry on. Oh, I can hear myself again. Okay, not everyone is back. We're gonna tell secrets about them, and then when they come back, we'll all go. I'm just gonna dive in, and Sherry can hit me later. Oh, here she comes. Thing worth being aware of here is you can define a contact. Normally we define a contact. These are people that get notified, but contacts also control who can see things in the web interface and are used in escalations. You can define a contact for someone that has no access to the web interface, and you can also define a contact who has notifications turned off. That way, for example, you might have a manager or some data person or something that needs to get into the web interface to look at stuff, but they don't need to get notified. So you can do that by twiddling the notification options and things like that. The one thing I'll point out here is the use. In the host notification options, I just answered my question for me. Host notification options, an important one here is the U for unreachable. So I say, when you're setting up all your hosts, make sure you define parents, the network topology. So you say that this host is behind this firewall or this switch. So if that switch or firewall goes down, then it knows that everything behind there is unreachable. And people would always say, but I set all that up and then my firewall went down and I got a million notifications. It's because they had the U for unreachable in their notifications. And probably you don't want that turned on. So you probably don't have U in your notification options so that you won't get paged about things that are unreachable. You'll get paged about the firewall is down. I can't get to it, but you won't get 200 messages for all the things behind the firewall. A gentleman this morning, I forget his name, I'm sorry, it was the talk about Nagios, dynamically tweaking Nagios when you bring machines up and down in the cloud for the gaming site. And he said, I said, well, did you ever think about just scheduling downtime through the command pipe? And he said, we tried that, and we got a zillion notifications when downtime was about to start. Wake up. And there, right there, it's the S. The S means send me a notification when downtime is about to start. And to my mind, that's a dumb option to have enabled because, look, you've scheduled the downtime specifically so you wouldn't get notified. You won't get messages that it's down because you know it's going to be down. So don't tell me it's about to go down because I already know that, for God's sake. So turn off the S as well. So which one? Pardon?
Some of our
Some of your sysadmins want to get mail when downtime is about to start. And they want to get paged when downtime is about to start. No, they just haven't gotten enough pages yet. Sooner or later, they'll figure out that, that's not so good.
So which notification options do you use?
Which notification options do I use? Down, up. Down, up, yeah. Yeah. So, actually, U means, oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, recovery. I was about to say, no, it's the U. I was missing a word there. Yeah. Because the flapping, if it's flapping, you've probably already got a notification that it's being goofy. And yeah, I don't want more noise. Now, what you can do is you can set things up. I was going to say you could set it up to mail you when it's flapping and not page you. I think that's more complicated. You have to put another layer in there somewhere. I do like layers. I'm all about the layers of indirection. The important thing about contact groups is if you want to do escalations, you escalate to another contact group. So for example, you might have a manager's contact group that only looks at the web interface, doesn't actually get paged, but maybe they'll get notifications as well. So that's where having even more contact groups is useful. Host definitions. In the standard examples, you define a host, you put the name in there, and then you put the host address in there, which is the IP address of the host. I believe that is wrong. If you put the host name and the IP address in your Nagios configs, you will probably also have them in your DNS configuration. Now you've got the same information in two places, and as I said just a few minutes ago, if you've got the same information in more than one place, it's wrong in at least one of them. So if you define the mapping between host name and IP address in more than one place, you don't know which is authoritative. So my religion is always put a fully qualified domain name in your Nagios configs. Don't put IP addresses there. Put names on every interface that you care about, and run on your local Nagios box a caching DNS server. Or make it authoritative, make it slave the zones that you have, or things like that. You don't want to get notifications if DNS is down and get notified that everything else is down, but my claim is you can avoid that by doing it locally. Now, if you really do want to have IP addresses in your config files, make your config files with the names in them, put a little flag on them, and run it through some sort of conversion process using sed or M4 or something to, when you actually generate your working configs, put the IP addresses in there. So the files you edit, put the names in there, and then take the address at the right time from DNS, look it up, put it in the file, if you really want IP addresses in there. I'm not sure I don't think you should do that, but it's okay for people to have different opinions. The other important thing is always define parents of a host. You define a host, define its parents, even if it's a switch or network, things like that. In my network, I want to make sure that the internet is up. In our office in Toronto, I work for FreshBooks, a fine online service company, online accounting for service-based businesses. You should go there. It's fabulous. And I missed lunch on Tuesday, but oh well, there you go. And we want to check things that are out on the internet. We have currently three connections going out from the office. And so I've defined the internet as Google. So it's out there. And then there's a thing beyond Google, so that the parents of Google are the three interfaces. And Nagios can deal with having a thing having multiple parents and does the right thing. So if you've got multiple ways to get somewhere, you can define the two parents. But I define the internet as Google. And then if I'm checking something out on the internet, I define if I can get to Google but I can't get to that thing, then I know. But if I can't get to Google, then I know all hell's broken loose. And it's not my fault. Knock on wood. But define parents, it's important. Host groups. I found a new religion, and I think I mentioned it in here somewhere. Define host groups and do additive inheritance for host groups. It's a huge win to just say, here's a host, and it inherits the standard Linux definition, which means I'm checking for all the SSH stuff and diskful and things like that. Plus, it's also a web server. Plus, it's also in this particular data center, which defines its parents and things like that. Yeah, you know that already. The important thing here is when we talk about a computing service, we usually think of, like a website is a service, or maybe a database server is a service. But remember that in Nagios terms, a service is just anything you want to check. You know, it could be your hot tub temperature. It could be that the lights are on, that the floor is not wet. So it's not necessarily a service that you're offering someone. It's just a Nagios term for something I want to check. So just keep that in mind. And you can do some interesting things by tweaking max check attempts, normal check interval, and retry check interval. For example, you may know that sometimes things go wonky and you're okay with them going bad for half an hour. So for example, a mail queue. You might want to check that your mail queue is less than some number of messages waiting to be delivered, like maybe 500 or whatever. But you know sometimes mail gets sent out in bursts. So your mail queue may peak, and that's normal behavior. Maybe not desirable behavior, but it's normal behavior. So in our mail queue checks, I have it set so that the max check attempts is something like 8 or something, and the check interval is 5, and the retry check interval is 5, which means the mail queue can go high for half an hour, and I won't get paged about it. But if it stays high for more than half an hour, then tell me about it. So you can fiddle with those things and tweak how things behave. We sometimes start it with the idea that we check everything every 3 minutes or every 5 minutes, and if it's down once, then tell me about it. But in many cases, you don't want to do those kind of things. So don't be afraid to twiddle those knobs. We talked about quoting. Yeah, you know all this. The interesting thing about notifications, when I first started at FreshBooks, it was set up to notify exactly once and then never tell us again until it recovers, which I'm not sure is optimal. If it's just one guy, it's like, okay, I know what the problem is. But when there's a group of people that are supposed to respond to things, if it only goes off once, you're going to say, oh, well, Bob got it or Sally got it and fixed it up. So being repetitively paged is probably a good thing. Set up the intervals in what's reasonable. You can always acknowledge, of course, and that'll stop the paging. You can stick notes so that there's a link in your web interface. So you can put a notes URL. In a couple of things I have some weird service checks that tell me if something's wrong, but it's not obvious from the service check name what it is. I do a check on, we use Puppet for configuration management. We have an SVN repository for Puppet. If somebody has checked something into Puppet but has not checked it out into the production location, there's a service check that tells us, oh, by the way, somebody needs to do the SVN up in the production Puppet location. And I have a note on that service definition, so if you say, well, what the hell is this? You can click on the note, and in the web interface of Nagios, it says, if this is alerting, this is what you have to do. So these are handy, especially if you have, we are all the smart people, the high-level senior sysadmins, and some of us may be lucky enough to have knock monkeys who look at the display, and then if something's wrong, they're supposed to act on it. You can put notes in there that refer to documentation or certain things. That's intended to make your life easier. So I mentioned earlier, always define parents. Parents is a network topological thing. So this machine is plugged into this router. That's a parent-child topology thing. There are also service dependencies, which is not a wiring thing. It's this service will not work unless this other service is working. The canonical example of that is my web server will not serve up the correct pages if my database server is down. And that's a service dependency. Set those up. That's also a good thing. Escalations are a good thing. I've only rarely been in a situation where there was someone I could escalate to, but sometimes you need to involve management, or you could have one on-call person who gets the first level pages this week, and then if they don't respond to it or if it doesn't get fixed within 3 pages, then it'll go to the entire group, for example. That's where escalations can be useful. My suggestion is always add contact groups, because you want the people that got the initial pages to also get the escalations. Otherwise, they'll think it's fixed, and their manager's getting paged, and the frontline people don't know that it's still broken. And additive inheritance, again, is a good thing. So you're adding on contact groups for the escalations. We talked earlier about host names and host groups and wildcards and regular expressions. There's a particular setting in Nagios config to enable regular expressions for host inclusion, probably turn that on. I think it's a good thing. One of the things that I believe, and a bunch of things I've said today, have to do with making sure you only write something down once. So you want to try and set up your configuration file so you avoid repetition. That's where templates come in. That's where custom variables come in, contact groups, additive inheritance, and things like that. Make your definitions as simple as you can. Macros, we know that. There's an interesting thing, and it took me a while to catch on to this. And in the olden days, I don't think all the Nagios variables were put into the environment. But somewhere along the way, every Nagios macro ended up in the environment. So that when your plugin's running, there's a million Nagios-related environment variables there. And that's really cool because you can do funny things. One of the things I talk about tomorrow is a little tool I wrote called Genoa, Generic Nagios, or Generic Notification Author. And basically what you do is, you know in those notification commands in Nagios where you have a printf and you print all these various variables and you pipe it into mail or crap like that, I replace all that with just invoke, run the Genoa command. And it has a bunch of templates, and I substitute environment variables into those templates, and out it spews. But because you can use all those Nagios macros in the environment, outside of Nagios, that there's some cool things you can do. So that's why I mentioned that there. There's some funny things you can do. You can do these on-demand macros so that in a notification for a particular service, you can refer to the state of another service. And this is more complicated than I've ever wanted to do. But you can say, in theory, you could send out a notification that says, web server number 1 is down, but I know that web server 2 is up. So you can get that notification, and you can say, well, I know they're load balanced, so maybe I'm okay. So that's the on-demand macros. And you can also do on-demand group macros. So if you had a web server farm, 10 web servers, they're all load balanced, one of them goes down, you could set up the notification to tell you the state of all the other web servers in that message. I think that's more complicated than maybe most people want to do. Okay. In the documentation, there's a theory of operations section. If you haven't read it already, read it. Any questions? Okay, good. It tells you how everything works. The interesting things like, how do you determine if a host is reachable? Because Nagios will tell you about network outages or things like that, and you can have multiple parents. It's all documented. It's really groovy. So the important thing about this one, when Nagios is doing checks, it can check a particular service multiple times before it actually tells you about it. The important thing to know there is that when it's about to retry, that's a soft state. So after you check your web server the first time and it fails, it goes into a soft fail state. Then after it's tried max retries times, it's tried it 3 times and it's down every time, then it goes into a hard fail state. Hard fail is when the notifications happen. Event handlers run at every step. So for example, if you have a web server that goes down every once in a while, you could set up an event handler to restart your web server, have it run on the first or second failure while it's still in a soft state. It'll reset it, and then when Nagios does the next check, everything will be, in theory, fine, and it will just go back to normal state, so you won't get paged. So if you have event handlers running, fire them off before Nagios service state checks get into a hard fail state. I hope that makes sense. If not, let me know. Stocking, if you've got a RAID array, and maybe you've got 2 spare disks in your RAID array and you're all set, and you get an error saying, oh, by the way, lost a disk in the RAID array, and you say, well, that's not a problem. I got a hot spare. I'll slot a new disk in on Monday. You acknowledge that problem, and then another disk fails, and then another disk fails, and you're screwed. You won't get notified unless you have stocking turned on. What stocking does is it says, if the message that you get from the plugin when you do the check changes, also tell me about the change. And for many things, it doesn't matter. If my ping time goes from 900 milliseconds to 902 milliseconds, really it's no different. If I've go from one disk dead to 2 disks dead, maybe I want to know about that. So keep that in mind. Volatile services, and I've never used these, it's a service that resets to OK after each check. So for example, and the canonical example is if you've got an intrusion detection system, set it up as a volatile check, it'll send everybody a notification that, okay, somebody intruded, and then it'll go back to normal. I'm not sure in practice if that's as useful as it might be, but there you go.
With the stalking, does the problem become unacknowledged?
If you're stalking a service and you've acknowledged it and the message changes, does it become unacknowledged? To be honest, I have no idea. I suspect it probably does. I think it probably just resets the notification logic, and I think goes back, but I don't know for sure. But somebody else that's here in this hotel right now knows that.
We do that for MySQL databases. So we have a database server and like about 15, 20 databases that get backed up. And we get a notification. It goes critical when any of those databases don't get backed up. So when there are more of them, we have stalking enabled and we acknowledge. The acknowledge gets thrown out for every new check.
It gets unacknowledged, and you get
Yes.
notified again. You have to acknowledge it again.
Yes, that is if it goes into a different state.
Perfect. Any state change reverts an acknowledgement. That makes sense.
What if it's in the same critical state but the text changes?
That's exactly the whole point of stalking. So yeah, it does.
So it turns off the acknowledgement. It treats it as a different problem. Yeah, new problem. Okay, I mentioned this before. Always define your topology, blah, blah, blah. And you can have multiple parents. So if you've got redundant links, Nagios does the right thing when you define that. It's a good. And I mentioned about notification option U. You don't want that. Okay, there's these things, and I've never used these. But basically, you can say, if this is broken over here, don't even bother checking this because I know it's not going to work. You'd have to really understand your Nagios config to do that, but there'll be places, obviously, where it makes sense. Oh, and there's a thing, this is not by default, but inherits parent, set that, and it will inherit service or host dependencies in other definitions. So if you have a template, and in that template you say, this depends on the database server being up, and then you include that template in another service definition. Inherits parent will also inherit those dependencies from the template as well, which is probably what you meant to do. I always try and make a joke about cached checks here. It never works. What Nagios can do is, on a busy system, it can remember that I checked something a minute ago and it was busted. It can say it's probably still busted now, or it's probably still good now. That's what cached checks is about. This is a mechanism for being more efficient, and it's a good thing. Turn them on. I mentioned event handlers before, and the canonical example is, if my web server is not responding, then restart it. Now the problem is that you're running the Nagios checks on the Nagios server as an unprivileged user. Your web server that you want to reset is probably somewhere else running as root, or at least needs to be restarted as root. How do you get from this unprivileged user over here to be a privileged user over there? There's a number of ways you can do it. It's not always an easy problem to solve. I'll give you an example of one time I did it. I had a Windows web server that had an add-on, and the add-on would cause IIS to jam up every once in a while. So I installed OpenSSH on the Windows web server, and I made up an event handler that would SSH in there as admin and run like netstart www3 svc or whatever it is to restart the web server. So it's possible, but you've got to think about the privileges that you want to allow to pass back and forth if you're going to use event handlers. We've also done a thing where we had a cable connection, and sometimes the cable modem would just get wedged and would need a power cycle. We had a power bar, so I set up an event handler to telnet into the power bar, turn the interface to reboot that power outlet, and everything would go back to normal. Now, I mentioned external commands earlier. It's a really cool thing you can do. Command pipe, you can tell Nagios to do almost anything. You can even give Nagios a command to stop itself. Most times you don't want to do that because then you can't give it a command to start itself. So just keep that in mind. You can actually stop Nagios from the web interface, I think, which is, you don't want to do it. You can do some interesting things there, and I have an example. So at work, I wrote a little shell script called nag command, which tosses things into the command pipe, and I use it to solve a particular problem, and I can't remember what the hell it was. But you can use it to schedule downtime automatically and things like that, or change who's responsible, or automatically acknowledge things if you want. So you can do some interesting things there if you're so inclined. Passive service checks, we talked about active versus passive service checks earlier. I told you what my religion is. These are handy for, as I mentioned here, SNMP traps. An SNMP trap is a device can send out a single UDP packet on the network saying, oh, by the way, this happened. And I don't believe you should rely on SNMP traps because it's a single unreliable datagram packet going out on the network if something happens. But sometimes you might catch a trap and it might be something useful for you. So your trap handler could submit a passive check result and things like that. If you have existing programs, you've got things behind a secure barrier where you can't get in there, but you can get out to the Nagios server, that's where a passive check can be useful. I have a little thing I'm working on, which is basically a little box built on the Raspberry Pi that you can put into a remote location that you may not control, and it can do things for you and send information out. So that's a place where passive checks could be useful. So Nagios has always had a way of doing distributed monitoring with NRDP and NSCA, where you set up a master Nagios box that knows everything, and then you set up subsidiary ones that know parts of everything, and then you tell the master box, don't do active checks, and you tell these guys, don't do notifications, and they send all their stuff back, and I've never really liked that. My approach is more, so things like DNX, I haven't used DNX, but it sounds like the right way to do things. Mod Gearman, same kind of idea, where you've got the one master server that just controls little puppets. Not puppet configuration management puppets, but like marionette puppets of doing work on its behalf. I think that's a better way to go. Or alternatively, set up multiple independent Nagios servers and then use something like Fusion or Thruck to aggregate that into one display. I think that's probably a better approach than the standard way. The problem with the standard way is if you use in the standard Nagios distributed monitoring thing, one of the problems people talk about with Nagios is that there's an overhead of doing a service check. The way you send distributed monitoring results back to Nagios, the central Nagios server, is you set up obsession, and you set up an obsessive compulsive service processor or a host processor, which means that for every service check you do, you run another command as well. So you essentially double your workload, and that kind of goes contrary to the idea of how you should do scalability. Or so I'll claim. Ta-da, your mileage may vary. Adaptive monitoring, you can throw things into the command pipe and cause Nagios to behave differently. And I don't have really good use cases on it. Somebody gave me an example where they have a load balancer and they have a couple machines behind the load balancer, and normally with a load balance thing, you have the services running on both machines, but they had to have it so that the service was only running on one machine at a time, and then it would fail over and start up here. So they had to point Nagios at the other server in the pair when it failed over. I thought that was a pretty extreme edge case of where you'd need it, but adaptive monitoring lets you do stuff like that. I just talked about obsession. I'm not sure it's a really good thing, but it's necessary in some cases. We talked a little bit about the event broker earlier on, and basically the event broker is a mechanism where you can dynamically load code into Nagios and extract information out of the event stream. Last time I looked, there was limited documentation about it. There was just a sample program, but there's more programs out there now that are actually using it, so you can steal that. But it gives you a bunch of flexibility, as I mentioned. So this is motherhood and apple pie about scaling up. Use the topological thing, so parent-child. Use good templates. Organize your configs the way you should. Version 3 adds a command or a configuration option that's large installation tweaks or hacks or something like that, which turns off environment variables, which takes away that utility, and it does a couple. And it instead of doing a fork exec, it does a fork exec, so slightly fewer processes overall. One of the things about now in Nagios 4, which I haven't looked at all, part of what's happening in Nagios 4, as I understand it, splitting into multiple processes, so it'll work across multiple cores or multiple processors better. But plugins have always been separate processes, so they've always been able to take advantage of separate cores or processors or things like that. So Nagios scales out fairly well, and these days when you go into the corner variety store and you can buy a computer with 12 cores of processor on it, more processing capability and memory is really, really cheap these days. So it's less of an issue than it was. So I'm not sure the large installation tweaks or hacks are that useful as they were a few years back. Dun, 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 dun. And here, remember I said embedded Perl is a bad thing? Now I'm reversing myself here and saying there may be some extreme cases if you've got a lot of plugins that are written in Perl. Maybe the embedded Perl will save you just enough overhead. I would argue that maybe you're better off rewriting your plugins in a more efficient language or a compiled language or offloading it somehow, but there you go. Time periods are pretty cool. An interesting thing about scaling up is that time periods let you say, I don't need to do that work at certain times of the day. So if your Nagios server is busy, you can cut out some of its workload if you know you don't care about things at certain times of the day. I mentioned large installation tweaks. I'm not sure that really buys us much these days, but there you go. Dun, dun, dun. So Nagios lets you do a certain amount of tuning. Nagios config, there's stuff there. See, I've been around long enough that I remember when machines were slow. We thought they were really fast, but they were slow. And now there's just scads of processing power these days. So there's less you have to worry about, I think. We talked about most of those things. Oh, there's an interesting thing, the fast startup options. In the normal case, you start up Nagios, it reads all its configuration files, and then sorts everything out, makes sure everything makes sense, and then it starts running. I think it started in version 3, or at least recent versions of version 3. You can have it pre-digest all its configuration files. So you can have Nagios running. If you want to update the configuration files, you can have it run Nagios with the right option, say, read and verify all the configuration files and store the digested copy in this directory here. And then you can tell the running Nagios to stop and start up. And by the way, your configuration has already been verified and digested, and it's right here. So it can restart faster. And so if you have many, many services, many hosts, if your configs are really big, that can save you time when you need to restart Nagios for new configs. The one thing I haven't said explicitly here, I'll say it again tomorrow morning, the smarter plugins make your life easier. So in your Nagios configuration file, you can say, this host, the user file system should have limits of 70 and 75% full, and warn me if it gets over those limits. Or you can have a plugin that figures out what file systems exist on a particular host, makes up limits, and says, this is probably what you meant. And so you don't have to set limits in your configs for each individual host, or things like that. You can have a smarter plugin that does work on your behalf, and that can be a really big win. And I'll mention a few more of those tomorrow, I believe. Host groups are your friends. I said this earlier. There's a cool thing. So at FreshBooks, we currently have 3 Nagios servers that act more or less independently. We have the office and we have 2 production data centers. And we have some host groups that exist only in production. So I have some convoluted stuff in our configuration files to handle the fact that I don't have anything in those host groups in the office. For example, I don't have a production web server in the office. So that Nagios server can't have that host group defined, so I had to jump through hoops. On my list of to-dos is upgrade to the more recent Nagios, which allows you to say, allow empty host group assignment. The advantage of that is that you can define all the host groups, and then if you have multiple Nagios servers, you can say, I just don't happen to have one of those things here. And that's just fine. You won't get complaints about it. Organize your config files. It's generally a good thing to do. Organize your files. And naming conventions, I mentioned earlier, you can use wildcarding on a naming convention. So apply this check to every host that starts with web something, WebStar, or if you name based on machine type, data center, company.com, you can do wildcards based on what data center they're in, things like that. So if you have a naming convention for all your devices, and it's not something like 7 dwarves or stars or things like that, if it's based on function or location, then you can use those things as wildcards in your configurations to save you trouble. Multiple servers, I said that was a good thing to do. Different internal groups, for example, you can set your contact groups to point, not everything has to be your problem if you have multiple people in your company. And potentially you could have different groups maintain different parts of the configuration. Gets a little more complicated, but potentially you could. Every once in a while I want to write the master plugin, and I just have one service check for a host, and it knows everything about that host and says, okay, the web server's up, the disks are fine, it's okay on memory, this host is good. So you could write a plugin that, put wrappers around plugins to make them smarter, bend them to your will. Talked about this. So I have a mechanism where I want to have different contact groups. So on a particular service, I want to say mail and page if something goes wrong, or just mail, or don't even send us notifications if something goes wrong. And in the normal, obvious case of doing that, you'd set up different contact groups and define different contacts and jump around. And I ended up doing an interesting thing with multiple templates and inheriting things in the configuration file, so that I only define an individual once, but they're included in multiple places. So, and if you want to see that, drop me a line and I'll show it to you. I used to have to deal with mail servers, and they had send mail milters running locally, and sometimes those send mail milters would die, and the local port that they had open would not be open, and so mail would not get processed. And I couldn't just do a check TCP because that port was not visible on the outside of the machine. But I've twigged finally to the idea that in the standard SNMP MIBs, you can ask what ports are open on a machine. And so I just had to look for port 3366 open on localhost on the machine. So I used SNMP to get into the machine and ask questions about the networking state that was only visible on the machine, not from outside. I was pleased with that. And then I tried it on Windows. Windows behaves slightly differently. I'll mention check all storage tomorrow morning, but check all storage is a plugin I wrote which basically does SNMP DF against a machine, finds out all the file systems it has, and keeps track of them. So look, a new file system, I'll just write that down here and I'll make up some limits in this little file. I'll say, well, it's 50% full right now, so I'll tell you if it gets to 75% full. So it just picks a midpoint as the limit, stuffs it in a file, so that it can deal with file systems coming and going. And I used to be in a place where we had NetApp filers, and we used to create LUNs all the time, so there'd be file systems appearing and disappearing, which was okay. But I didn't have to change the Nagios configuration because my check all storage plugin would just say, oh, file system's there, or it's not there, and it would make up the right limits. So a smarter plugin was helping me out there. I'm going to mention check SNMP exec tomorrow morning, but basically, if you set up execs in your SNMPD configuration file of all the commands you can run, you can also ask SNMPD for a table of all the commands it can run, and the particular OID, SNMP OID that you will use to run those commands may differ based on how many commands are defined and in what order on that particular machine. My check SNMP exec plugin gets the exec table, finds the one called check local disk, and then does the right SNMP query to cause that one to run. So it's another level of indirection. It's the plugin doing work to figure out what you actually want to run. And I check Windows services. I get the use SNMP, get the table of all the Windows services that are running on a machine. And then I say the services I expect are running, and life is good. So one of the things, it took me a while to figure this one out too. Sometimes you can't get into the machine you want to query. Maybe there's a firewall in the way, but maybe it's got a web server running. So you could set up a page in the web server which gives you the information you want. So do an HTTP GET against that page in the web server. It's a PHP page. It runs a command for you, returns a string. You do a regular expression match on the page. It tells you whether things are good or bad. So even if you can't SSH in somewhere or NRPE in somewhere or have some other access into a network, if there's some service exposed, you could sometimes twist that service to do something else for you. And in the web server, you can restrict access to that page based on where you're coming from using Apache's allow, deny, and things like that. So you can do some weird things that way. I mentioned that I'm making a little box so that if you have to get into some other network and you can't get in, maybe you could put a box in there or a server of your own in there and have it probe stuff and report back to you. So that's a way of getting around other limitations. A host that you define in Nagios doesn't actually have to exist. I was in a situation where I had multiple SMTP servers in a data center, and I wanted to make sure that at least one of them was running. I was checking the individual machines, but I wanted to make sure that my mail service was running so that machines could submit messages. And I made up a machine that didn't actually exist, and it has two service checks, or it just has one service check hitting the generic DNS-A record for smtp.datacenter.company.com just to make sure it works. So a host doesn't actually have to exist in order to do checks against that so-called host. I also did an interesting thing. We used to have an outsourced help desk, and they would respond to problems, but the only problem they would respond to is dead host. We had redundant network links between Toronto, Detroit, and the other office in Toronto. And there was a triangular link, and he says 5 minutes to go. Okay, good. I've got a lot of slides left to go, but all the rest of it's crap anyway. And so I made up a host that had the host check. Instead of doing check ping for a host to see if a host is up, it was a service check to make sure that that network link was actually up, so that the network link would go down and it would say, oh, this host is down, and then the knock monkeys would say, oh, the host is down, that's a problem. Whereas if I had a service check saying, oh, this service is down, they'd say, I don't care. So you can cheat. You can make up things that claim to be hosts that are not hosts, and you can make up things on hosts that don't actually exist. This was the the 7-layer OSI model, and then financial and political. This was at the political layer, so I was dealing with that. I'll talk about negate tomorrow, but wrappers around things, another layer of indirection. Negate, it's the coolest damn plugin in the world. It just inverts the sense of a check. So if you have a machine that should not be running SSH or should not be running a web server or a mail server, then you do the regular check and you negate it so that if the SSH server ever gets turned on, you'll get told because it's negated and it does the right thing. So negate's pretty cool. Every once in a while we have hack-offs at work where you're trying to impress the other people, and I wrote a little thing that hooks into Nagios that has a revolving orange trouble light hooked up to a power bar that I could turn on and off. And so I had an event handler, so if something went wrong, it would make the light spin around and go woo woo. Everybody thought that was cool, and I got a beer for that. Simple shell scripts are very powerful plugins. Keep that in mind. Add-ons, I don't think I'm going to touch anything but here. There's a million different graphing things. I'm not going to say anything about any of them, and I'm going to skip through here quickly. You know about those. There's a picture. I stole that picture again. NRDP. NRDP, actually, I was trying to fiddle with NSCA today, and I said, oh, there's no authentication at all in here. NRDP is less bad that way. Event broker stuff, NDO utils, DNX. This is my thing I wrote, so I want to get into somewhere else, and this is a wrapper around other stuff, and I'll talk about this tomorrow as well. But a wrapper around a thing does things differently based on other information it has available. And I think it's really cool, but then I wrote it. There's a bunch of people writing other things for add-ons. Merlin and the other thing. Merlin and Ninja, they were started a couple years ago. I don't know if they've made much progress, but there were just different interfaces and different mechanisms that were handy to see. You might want to have a look at those. Status screen, there's a thing called Naglite 2, which essentially aggregates various multiple Nagios servers and gives you an overview screen, you know, green, red, things like that. And I also mentioned Thruk. Thruk's pretty cool. Which I like. Okay, so I skipped over some of the last bit there. The add-ons, you know there's a million add-ons, and people will talk about them and you can go look them up. And I got 2 minutes to spare according to my watch. Before we wrap up, are there any questions? Is it on the bottom?
I know I asked this before, but with host groups and using them for a service, can you exclude hosts that you don't want that service to run for?
So I think you can. So if you've got, well, I think you can, because you can say, if you're defining a service, there's 2 lines. One, this service applies to these hosts, and this service applies to these host groups. So you can list a bunch of host groups, and then I think on the host line you can say exclamation mark host name, which excludes it. I think that's pretty much the only case where you can do it. But I think you can. And I think one of the pages I skipped over shows an example of that earlier, I think. Thank you very much. If there's anything else that comes up, or if you really want to say to me, you know, John, that thing you said, that was really, you know, you can please talk to me today or tomorrow or the next day. And thank you very much, and have a good time.